All right, so what we're going to do is this is really a conversation with Wu and Roya and all of you. And I'm going to ask the first question just to give all of you a chance to get your thoughts together and come up with some questions, and then we'll see what happens. So my question is actually, draws off the very end of the film about the idea of a social movement, but also about your collaboration. And, I thought it was really lovely what you said at the beginning about all the collaborators that it took to make the film. So I was wondering if the two of you wanted to expand a little bit on working together and how that kind of artistic collaboration is related to making a movement and all the people it took to make the film.
Well, I started making Wildness kind of a bit not fully aware. I was throwing this party and documenting, and about 3 years into the process of making the film, I had a documentary that was kind of a verite talking head film that I felt was like close, but something was really not right. But it was my first time ever making a film, so I really didn't know what it was, and I was actually doing something that you should never do, which I was submitting my rough cut to festivals. But I feel very lucky because I happened to, Roya, who was at the time at Tribeca, she happened to see it, and we ended up connecting. We were sort of connected socially, but we never really talked. So it was kind of a huge leap, I think, for both of us to just decide, okay, we're gonna just figure out how to make this film, something that it, realize its potential. So, so we kind of like took a year and took the whole thing apart and wrote a narrative script for it. And yeah, maybe you want to say more about that?
Yeah, it's amazing to work with an artist like Wu because he's so vulnerable, and there's this way that I just came in having not ever gone to Wildness because I was at the time writing my PhD, and for my dissertation.
No wildness allowed.
I didn't actually write the PhD, I wrote the dissertation. And, but my girlfriend was always going to Wildness, and she'd be like, "Are you sure you don't want to go? It's so much fun." So Wildness itself had this myth for me. There had been this myth that had built up around it. So when I saw the film, the documentary that Wu had submitted, I saw all these different things in it that really reflected kind of different issues that were really important to me around space and curatorial practice and social movement, things that were part of my dissertation. So we started working together, and it was just like, it was like a brain meld. And it was really, really inspiring because we would just be together for days and days and days, and I would just hear. And then I started to pretend to be him, and
It was weird.
Yeah, did you dress like him?
Weird. And we had this idea of having the bar be a character. And initially the bar spoke as Vaginal Davis, when the idea kind of came. And we just both ran with it, and it was just really exciting. And then Mariana Marroquin, speaking of collaborators, she's not older. How old is she? 23?
She's the same age as me. She's 31, I think.
And she just has this timeless voice that just feels like it occupies the entire universe somehow. And then Michelle Lawler, the cinematographer, is I think so talented. So she was a really important part as well, because we started doing a lot of pickups. Once we realized that we were trying to create something that was a magical realist film, there were a lot of extra things that needed to be done that Michelle and Wu worked on.
And also, something that I think is interesting is that shot of the picnic is actually the last thing that we filmed, and it was it was actually the beginning of the film for so long in the editing process, and I just kept being like, what is happening here? What are we doing? And actually what we were doing was I had this random idea that I wanted to shoot this Nan Golden photograph that's called Picnic at the Esplanade. So literally it was a picture of a moment that I felt very connected to that had absolutely nothing to do with me or my life, in the sense that I wasn't even alive when that photo was taken, but I was thinking a lot about just the fantasies that I had about gay liberation and the women's movements and civil rights movements. And so a lot of this film was really about looking at images of civil rights movements and really being why is it that none of these things are actually like really what I experience in my daily life. So I was just kind of looking around and being like, well, what does it actually look like? Like, what does a movement look like right now? And through doing the legal organizing with this clinic that we started, and working with Dean Spade a lot, who's someone that I've been in dialogue for many years about trans resistance stuff. Like, I felt like I had this kind of idea of what trans resistance was, but then I was also like living my life, and it started to like feel like there was all these connections and I could like see them, and I didn't want to like overly intellectualize them. I just wanted to make them felt like in the way that I think films have a power to do. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, one of the great things about starting the Utopia conference with this film is precisely that those images of what social movement is, what resistance is, can be both inspiring and disabling. And, you know, because one's life isn't like that, even if you're a participant in those movements as it's happening. It's very different. As I say, you know, the early feminist press, Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press, was made around a kitchen table, literally, not in, you know, a big thing where it looks like those photos. So I think that the film really helps in imagining utopias that are empowering in the way that DJing can be. So that was really lovely.
I think the other thing is that I was very moved by Kimberly Springer's book, Living for the Revolution.
Yeah.
And just thinking about how just because movements kind of fail, I mean, because movements are so ambitious, like social justice movements, like, we're gonna free everyone. It's such
Tomorrow,
a large
too.
project that it almost needs to fail so that it can just keep being born in the different ways that it needs to be born given our current situations and contexts and the shifts that happen. And so I remember that part of the beginning of this process was, how can we think about wildness as something that happened and then that had its problems and then that went away, and that doesn't mean that failure is like a bad thing, or that imprenta was there but then it kind of wavered. It's not bad.
I remember having a conversation with Dean like not long after we lost the space and we were kind of trying to figure out what we were, and like the clinic was mobile for a while, but I remember kind of like, I felt like we'd failed completely, and I was like talking to him about it. I was like, well, you know, I mean, I think we actually kind of managed to do a lot, considering that we started out as a party. We were like a party, you know, that we weren't planning on doing like name and gender changes, but we actually were able to do that for a lot of people. And so I was kind of like, yeah, you know, whatever. And he was like, yeah, but you know, like pretty much everybody comes to activism and they're figuring it out for the first time. And I realized that I had this fantasy that there were all these people out there that were doing this work and that were really good at it, and I was like this amateur, or I was like this kind of fringe kind of enthusiast, but not actually, you know, like, I don't know, I just didn't think I was like real enough for it. And I just realized that like, actually, like, that's a perpetual thing. Like, everybody's always coming to their point of feeling like they can do something, or they could say something, or like, things don't have to be the way they are, and like, there isn't actually somebody in another room doing that, except for all of us, so, or something, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really crucial point in terms of there's a book called Moving Mountains, the concept of which is the idea of a successful failure. And I think that in some ways maybe Utopia is just a successful failure. It's not going to go on forever in perfection, but it can be a successful failure, and that Wildness really shows that.
There was an interesting arc in the film in that you've had loss and death, and you had the clinic sort of next door, and so you were able to really include all of these interesting highs and lows. And so I'm wondering, what was the impetus to start making the film, if that wasn't really what the intention was to make this sort of groundbreaking film, seeing as you feel as though you happened upon activism? So I'm interested in knowing what was really the impetus in even beginning to film.
I think it was actually, like I mentioned about just documenting, I was doing that more as a performer who was trying to like support other performers by like just helping like film their performances and doing some interviews with the owners of the bar and some of the patrons, because their stories were very interesting to me, and I wasn't really putting it together. But I actually think it was sometime around the LA Weekly article, this like kind of moment where Wildness started to get very popular, and there was this kind of blowback about, you know, whether our party was going to cause, you know, some serious problems and for like visibility and exposure, and were we gentrifying the bar, and like, and then this article came out, and that was kind of like a point of like explosion, I think, of discussion, especially like on the internet, of people like, especially in the comment section, like, you know, just sort of taking a side, like, well, it's Wildness's fault, or like, no, Wildness, you know, whatever, like, just kind of arguing about like who actually belonged at the bar, and like who didn't belong there. And so anyway, I started this blog, and like I just started trying to track like all the experiences and the different like conversations I was having. And I think around then I just thought that I wanted to make something out of all this material that was gonna be in the same way that I was like struggling to find a voice with the blog, like something that was accessible and like coherent that I could actually share with anybody who might have gone to Wildness or who might have followed it online or who might care about these issues. So it was really like a desire as a film, as an artist, as a visual artist, and as an activist, like I just felt like movies are they have so much power to like communicate because they're such a familiar language. And Roya like really was a film language, like she knows a lot about how to communicate that way, I think, because you have such a background in film. So I think it was really profound for me to be able to collaborate this way, because I learned a lot about story from her and like the power of that. So.
And considering the fact that you're part of this movement and there are so few films on this subject matter, how do you feel that like the community isn't really documenting this in a visual, more as a just verbal? You saying that films have this power, how do you feel about the lack of documentation in that matter?
I mean, I think there's a risk in, I was never striving for visibility necessarily in creating this, because I just think that actually the ultimate result of what Wildness ended up being as a story and how we ended up with like the character of Wu and like the character of the bar is like, we were really dealing with issues of how to represent something, you know, and like the problems when you do, specifically in film. And I think that actually, if anything, normally I would be like, let's not make this like a film about this community at this place for this moment, because it felt like that would actually, I don't know, I just didn't want it to be misconstrued or like misappropriated or whatever. And I mean, I think also like I had to come to terms with a lot of the protectiveness that I felt about the experiences that I had, and wanting like to create safe spaces the way that like Wildness was a safe space, or like Silver Platter is a safe space, and like wanting to like sort of control the narrative so much that like the film would continue to like maintain safety, and then also kind of having to go through a process of letting go and being like, well, actually all I can do is like try to put all these pieces in the right place so that hopefully they contain that kind of recipe for like consciousness, you know, but I can't guarantee that like everyone that sees the film is gonna walk away with like a sensitive understanding of like what it is. So if anything, like visibility was like the scariest part about this whole process, I think. I don't know, I'm sure you have lots to say about that.
I mean, I think when we started working together, I think the thing that was most uncomfortable, for you, with the documentary that you had before I started working on it with you, was that the film could be read as about the Latina transgender women of the bar. That people could go away and after having seen the film and feel like they learned something about those women, like they got a little package or something about them. And that's why we really wanted to make it more about kind of that slip between what's real and what's not real. We didn't want people to come away with some kind of sense of truth. We wanted people to kind of experience a story. And you know, when you go into a bar or a nightclub, everybody at the club has just a totally different experience. So what we wanted to do is kind of tell this story through Wu's perspective. And you know, the bar is just a projection of Wu as well, right? But when in our writing process, a lot of it, you know, Wu would say something like, that's not something I would say, or that feels really uncomfortable. I'm sounding so like dumb or naive. And I'd be like, that's not you, that's Wu the character, right? So we were trying to actually separate, and this is something that, you know, in documentary there is a lot of conversation around like authenticity and these questions of truth, and we wanted to unsettle it. So that was something that was really important for us in creating the film, so that we wouldn't get wrapped up in this kind of burden of representation, even as it'll be put on the film anyway, because there are a few films but about this kind of subject, but we wanted it to not be about the subject. We wanted it to be about the experience and the feeling of space and community and what it means to be together and how we build things together and how things fall apart.
And I really want to congratulate you. I think that You are opening with a threshold of what Utopia is now. If you think on the outrage movement that overtook the plazas, the Occupy movement, the formula of excess and successful failure, and excess and not having words to say what the movement, or to forward what the movement was willing to do. I remember here in the States, Occupy was 2 years ago, and they, in the news, the media was completely disregarding the movement because they didn't say what they wanted. They were just there denying and occupying and exceeding, and the word excess comes to my mind when you just embrace this nonsense apparently, but it's everything about the body and pleasure and desire, and also security and boundaries and legality. And what I wanted to ask, first, congratulating you, because I think you are on the track of what new social movements are in this utopic sense. And my question is this evolution of the excess and the party to the legal clinic, because I find it awesome, guys, that you did that also, that you evolved into the opposite of excess, the legal modern thing that will accompany this incredible utopian new social movement.
Well, I always like in-between spaces. I mean, the beginning of the film is this twilight magic hour, and that's kind of like a motif that I wanted to carry through, is this sort of this moment that is so ephemeral, and it's like something is possible in that moment. And I think something that happened, at least in my personal experience of doing Wildness, and that how that kind of evolved into this like more activist project of Let's Go Liberation, was that the two things made the other thing really strong. Like, I think having like this daytime like activism happening in the context of the party, like I felt like helped to ground what it was. Like, it was almost like after, you know, at the end of the day, like once we were really rolling with all of that stuff, nobody really questioned what we were doing there. I think at a certain point, that was our mandate, was that we felt we needed to be really clear about and upfront about what our politics were and like who we were. And once that was really clear, I think people really like understood, and that was something that was amazing, because I mean, not every person on the planet, you know, but like way more people understood, and that felt really satisfying. And then I think also, like, you know, from the experience that I've had working as a grassroots organizer, I think there can be more pleasure in that, you know, and there can be more kind of messiness in that, and even just like, I think the model of the bar as like a business, you know, like it's like, what I took from the Silver Platter, from my experience working there, was just like, what made sense to me is that everybody had a reason to be there. We were all motivated to like benefit. Like, we were making money, we weren't making a lot of money, but we were making like enough to sustain ourselves. And we were creating community in a way that was like contingent upon an actual like exchange of money and cash and like resources, and like all that stuff was really clear because it was a business. And you know, so I don't know, I just think I like kind of took some of that in thinking about the group of lawyers and the collective, the non-hierarchical governance of the collective, and like just, I wanted to be like, look, let's all really figure out why we're doing this. It's not just for a pat on the shoulder. You know, it's not just to feel like we're doing good. Because I felt like that whole model of like, altruism or whatever, just even the whole discourse around privilege, I just feel like there's a very patronizing, or this sort of top-down like kind of stuff that's like deep in it, and I wanted to kind of like unpack that or something.
And I think that when we were working on developing the story and the arc of both the character of the bar and the character of Wu, it was, you know, this is a coming of age story in many ways. And Wu is almost set up as a hero, as a young hero in the beginning, about to go on a hero's journey. But there's this way that in film and in coming of age stories, it's so much about the individual realizing themselves. And this the way that we structured the narrative was to kind of turn that on its head, so that it actually became about, not about the individual protagonist kind of becoming this almighty kind of person that saves everybody, which is how hero narratives are structured, but more that he recognizes that he's actually part of something that's much larger, and he is able to find his place within a larger community. So it's like the de-individualization process, almost. So yeah, just to add that.
That's really good.
Do you like de-individualize?
Yeah.
Never thought about
Collectivize,
that.
that's the word, sorry.
Yeah, blame it on the PhD. Right back over here.
I have a question about which speaks to the what you just spoke of.
That thing.
There's a part in the
De-individualization.
film where you talk about how you gave into the stereotype, or almost like just said, you know what, these stereotypes exist, or not. It was part of the movement, and it sort of changed your momentum in the film and how you projected the rest of the movement. So can you speak about that a little bit, and that part where you sort of realized sort of what you were and what you weren't? Just because I feel like it speaks about other types of individuals, such as myself, and when you realize that these stereotypes exist, am I going to continue to fight, or am I going to just go with the movement?
Sorry, just to distill your question.
Yeah. Okay, so it's a little bit complicated. So the part in the film where there's a section where after the article comes out, and there's, you speak to the article person, the person, whatever. Yeah, so the point is that there's a part where in the film you say, I'm gonna not give into the stereotypes, but just say your momentum, your fight was almost not the same anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think like so many things in your question, like big things that are important, like one thing that makes me think about is just that it almost mirrors the process of like coming to find the final form of the film and the story, the narrative, because I think in a way we were really referring to both of those problems, like in actual life and also in trying to like recreate the story, because it's just so hard to like make an image that's complicated, that isn't like just reacting to the one that people want to have, without being completely incoherent. And I think that was like the challenge, was like, obviously we can like be who we are and like understand each other in this coded way in our corner of the world, but like if we're gonna tell a story that's gonna be circulating in with wider audiences, like how can we find a way to like represent, that isn't just like we're giving in to like simplifying in the way that we know we're expected to, and somewhere in between there is like a way to like have a truth, that's like understandable. And I also think it's just, maybe this is getting back to what we said at the beginning, but like I have this kind of theory that like community only really exists in representation. Like it's only when you capture that image that you can say, okay, and then it's like kind of like this quantum physics thing or something where you're like, as soon as you've got it, it's already moved in another direction, so like it's actually that you can never see it until you look through a lens, and then when you're making that representation is always going to be kind of refracted through what your intention is as the maker or like as the individual.
Yeah, that leads me to another question, which is, if Wildness were still going, could you have made the film? Like,
No.
did the end of it, in order to capture the image of the community and share it with all of us who are not in LA, and did it have to end for that next thing to happen?
I don't think it would have been possible. I mean, for a lot of reasons of like processing, but also just, I don't know, there's this image towards the end when I'm talking about like what happens to everybody, and there's this image of everybody standing together. And that photo was actually taken after Wildness had ended, like at this other bar where we tried to do a party that completely failed. And like, because it was too soon and everyone was totally traumatized. But I felt like weirdly superstitious because as soon as I took that photo, I was just like, I knew that that was truly the beginning of the end because I felt like I could finally see everybody. Like there was something weirdly that always happened, like someone would always be missing when there was time to do a group picture, and I was always like missing people in like the frame, and like I finally had like my perfect image, and I was like, oh, that must really be the telltale sign that I'm able to see it, and therefore it doesn't exist anymore. I don't know if you trippy.
I mean, I think that because I didn't ever go to Wildness, but my experience of this kind of experience was being part of the Women of Color Research Cluster at UC Santa Cruz, the Women of Color in Collaboration and Conflict Research Cluster. And you know, we worked together, but it was, I didn't fully realize what I had until I left Santa Cruz, and then I was living in Los Angeles, and then I moved to New York. And I didn't realize what that community was. And so one of the things that we wanted to, you know, do in this film was to think through the process of building alliances and coalitions with people and allowing for conflict to actually be inside of there. And so my time at Santa Cruz and working with the Women of Color in Collaboration and Conflict Research Cluster was really important because of this idea of coalition and conflict as being part of each other. And I think that there's only so much that we can do around representation in terms of fighting and debunking one group of people's images of people of color, or one group of people's images of gay people or transgender people. And I think at a certain point we have to start creating our own representations and our own stories, and part of that is also creating our own myths. And the way that we're going to do that is by sharing space with one another, and also hurting each other and sleeping with each other and you know, falling out with each other and burning out and then needing to go away so that we can then see what happened, right? And then be able to come back in and create something totally different. So, yeah.
And I also think like something that Wildness has experienced since it's now, you know, getting out into the world, and we've played some festivals and, you know, done different things like a variety review, like big things that are like hard to achieve as coming from where we're coming from given the subject matter of the film. And I've noticed that, you know, it's really hard to be, if you are people of color and you're making a film, the presumption is like you're gonna make a film that's about a certain thing in a certain way, right? So if you're doing that differently, people think you don't know what you're doing. You know, so it's like, it's really hard to be, you're actually inventing language, you're actually innovating, artistically innovating, and your subject matter is this other thing. It's like really hard to kind of squeeze through that door, and I think we've managed to do it in certain ways, but I've also definitely felt the ceilings in these moments where people like are just confounded. Like there's just way too many things that are challenging about it, I guess. I don't know.
First of all, again, thanks again, congratulations. I have a lot of questions, but I'll just boil it down to one. Where did the name Wildness come from, and what, how has its meaning changed for you and those who were participating in it, for those who never went to it, like Roya, and what does it mean now?
Wildness came out of a meeting between me and Ashlyn and Daniel when we were first decided to want to throw a party at the Silver Platter. I mean, after we'd asked them and they had said, yes, of course, please do. And so we got together, and actually our first idea was to call the party Women. We were going to call it Women. But then we decided to call it Wildness, and I don't remember why. It was definitely Ashlyn's idea. I think Ashlyn, who's one of the DJs, is a very important, I think, like, leader in at least the community I'm a part of, in terms of like shaping space around like party. So yeah, and what is it? And yeah, and I think it's interesting because like we've all gone on these different trajectories, at least like the Wildness organizers have. Like the 3 other people that I was collaborating with have all become kind of pretty much like full-time DJs and have these awesome careers. Like they're all going to Tokyo Fashion Week next week or something. I don't know. So like that's also something that I have, you know, been very reflective of and thinking about, even just as the film was coming together, already imagining what that would mean for it to come out and like what its potential successes or failures or whatever like would mean, and the inevitability of appropriation and like things kind of letting things go, and like, you know, like a big thing was sort of like, you know, I remember going to this film market at IFP where they were like, you could have Wildness margarita glasses, like, you know, like just like you know, like things that normally you do to like promote your film, and I was just like, I will not have a margarita glass of that. But like also just like we haven't tried to recreate wildness in any space ever, because it's just, I think that was just an obvious like thing for the people involved because of who we are, was that we weren't trying to codify it, but also not trying to hold on to it in an overly precious way. So something in the middle, I guess. Yeah, I think Gonzalo is a huge, important person in the community, and a lot of different people recount it in different ways, but he was really the person who, you know, when his brother died in '91, he inherited the bar and was much more open to people of different queer and different gender presentations. And so, like, Rogelio would be like, if you're gonna dress up, go out in the street, you know? But Gonzalo was very welcoming, and he was the one that actually invited the first performance, like drag shows, to start happening. And so he was really, I think, an era of like supporting, you know, trans and genderqueer community. And so I think it wouldn't be what it is today. And certainly Wildness wouldn't have been what it was without our kind of relationship to him, so.
Yeah, and I found that in a way the most moving moment in the film was the moment of silence, and it reminded me of what you said, Wu, about the way in which community is constituted in these spaces that are open and without something, because the point of a party is to make noise. You get to let loose and make as much noise as you want. And I was really shocked at the absoluteness of the silence in that moment, and it was to me an amazing moment of respect for Gonzalo and of community among the people there, that they could come together to do that particular act, which is not the act you come to a bar to do. So I thought that was really beautiful.
One of the things I noticed about the film was the music, and how house music is like such a big thing for like, the gay community. And I wanted to know, knowing that like the soundtrack was amazing, and what was the symbolism behind the music for, like, what was the drive that the music played in the community, and how did that help the movement?
I really think that everything about like how I understand Total Freedom and Nguzu Nguzu, the DJ is like their whole practice, which is really what is the soundtrack of the film is really their music. It's music that they like mainline to me, or that I heard in the club. But I mean, it was really the Silver Platter, I think, was like a genesis for them around sort of combining the sort of Latin, like the cumbia reggaeton sounds with like house music, and I think today like that's still, like that's something that has like proliferated in a lot of ways, and I think it's really exciting.
I don't know if this goes without saying, but it's, when I watch the film, it fills me so much with like emotion, and it's the music that kind of leads you into those moments. And it's also just, it's nice to have that kind of feeling around social movements, because they are so hard. So it's nice to be able to like sit back and reflect, you know. So when next time you're in an activist meeting and people are fighting and you're like, oh, why is that person talking so long? And, you know, I want to go home and I'm so tired and I don't have any more time. And, you know, it's nice to like then, you know, hear this music of this film, and you're like, okay, like it's so inspiring and rejuvenating, but it also just points to the importance of like just joy and togetherness, and, you know, just this feeling that we also need to sustain ourselves, you know? And I love the music of this film. Whenever I hear like a song in somewhere, I'm like, Wildness, where is it?
Well, that's a great question. Wildness, where is it? We should all go around asking that in our lives from now on.
Thank you again for this amazing film. I was actually curious about the scene where it looked like a film was being made of a performance about the El Salvador situation. And it was taking us away from some of the things we've been talking about. But I'm curious about what was happening there. Like, did it come out of a sort of collaboration that made that memory work possible for those people? Is that another film that we could somehow see?
Yeah, that's a short film
thanks.
called Damelo Todo, which originally was a part of Wildness and kind of split off because the story made very little sense in the context of the larger thing, except that it did, well, weirdly enough, like, well, okay, so Raquel Gutierrez wrote the script, and we filmed in the bar with some actors that were from the community, and a lot of people from the community like participated, and what am I saying?
Just really quickly, Raquel Gutierrez, who's part of the Buchlalis, and they are this like really sexy performance troupe that was doing work for a while.
Oh, I remember. So yeah, Raquel had this fantasy of this character, and it was really her story that she wanted to tell, which was inspired by her experience of going to Wildness at Silver Platter. And then actually I was going through these Gold Curtain interviews, and I heard Betty say, oh, I'm from El Salvador, and I came from the war. And I was like, whoa, crazy. So then we did an interview with her, and it turns out that her story was completely like paralleled the story that was completely fictional, which I kind of love just because it's like, you know, you would think that's like some sort of recreation that we made, but it's actually that the fantasy found the reality. So like, it just seemed like they managed to like interweave, and so, yeah.
That's really a beautiful the relationship between fiction and realism that the film is going for. That's just amazing. So, and the way in which that can make things possible in reality that aren't otherwise.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the behind the scenes, and if you can describe how you were able, or if you feel like you were able to overcome some of the privileges that come with being an artist, being educated, and I assume that you are a US citizen. And I'm mentioning that because of the fact that although Latinos are also Americans, it is clear that some of them saying the film or referring the film to the gringos, to the you know, to the people who were coming to Wildness as quote-unquote Americans. Can you talk about that notion of belonging and that mythology of what it means to be an American within this specific community? Because it is obvious that there were two communities at play here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really important, huge question, and I think it's a very central thing that the film actually really does try to explore, is like sort of like, what is this, what constitutes the Wildness kids, you know, and the Silver Platter community or whatever, and like, there was some like difficult to articulate kind of sense of difference, and I try to include a lot of different ways that people discussed it, and I don't necessarily have an answer to like how that all breaks down. I do feel like in the film, I had a mandate to be as transparent as I could be and be as critical as I could be, and try to show things that might normally have been sort of like not as comfortable to like look at as my role as a filmmaker and as an artist coming in. I think like within the Wildness group and also within the filmmaking team, including Roya and Mariana Marroquin, we all had different relationships to our immigration situation. I think we all brought different perspectives to that. I'm a second-generation immigrant, so like my father came here illegally, and I grew up in a suburb in New England. So yeah, like it's just in one generation, like a lot can change for people's perspectives. And I think in one way, like for me, maybe making this film in a personal way was like, because my father never like wanted to ever talk about his experience of his immigration because it was so painful, and he wanted to forget it, and he wanted to like move forward, you know. I don't know, I've never understood what that means, but I heard a lot of people say that in interviews as well. And so I think in a way, like it was me trying to come to terms with, or like create a myth of my own, because I felt this closeness to something, but I didn't understand it at all. I don't know if you want to say more.
Yeah, and then me as well, you know, there's that line where she says, what happens if you get deported and nobody in your country ever wants to see you again? I don't face threats of deportation. I am a US citizen. But, you know, I do live in exile from Iran, and my mom came over 8 months pregnant, 7 months pregnant, and, you know, there was this whole idea of, like, being an American citizen, but it's not like I could ever go back, right? And especially, even if I could go back, I would not be able to leave, so then what would that be as, like, as a lesbian being there in Iran now? Like, so those kinds of questions have really informed how we thought about the space, you know, and
also
people's relationships.
Yeah,
there.
in collaboration with Mariana, particularly around the immigration issue, because that section that's about like in Los Angeles, the protests and the immigration situation, and then Erica talking specifically about her own experience. That section was written where the bar is speaking there. That was written very closely in collaboration with Mariana. Pretty much, I feel like some of those sections are her verbatim talking about her experience of being an illegal immigrant and crossing over, and like her kind of path that she now has a green card, which she just basically got like yesterday or something. But like essentially like a lot of these things were very close to her, and she felt like she wanted to actually speak them in a way that I might have been like, well, I don't want to speak for something that's not my direct experience, so I'm not gonna like exploit the subject matter. I want to be very careful with how it's like narrativized, because there's a way that it could be sensationalized. So I think like Mariana was like a really key voice in that she actually pushed me to like say some things that were very simple and very like important about like the pain of it. So
Yeah, so in that way also like the writing it was such a process of layering different kinds of experiences. It's such a meld, not just between Wu and I, and also between Wu, me, and Mariana, but also even with, Wu had done lots of interviews with people around the bar, people who went, and all these, so there was also this kind of sense of different things that people were saying. So we were trying to kind of think, we weren't trying to have one perspective. That's what the two characters allows for, both Wu and the bar. We were trying to actually create a character where there were multiple perspectives in it, right? So it didn't have to be a coherent thing.
Something that you just said I feel is really important. One of the characters or one of the actual people telling their story, and that's prompting you to discuss, unpack some of your own pain. One of my favorite things about this film was that it wasn't about pain. Very many stories about communities of color or LGBTQ issues are all about how everyone's sitting around crying all day and night. But this seemed to be a lot of celebration of life and happiness, and the pain that I saw most often was the pain of disenfranchisement and not being able to turn to the police, or not being able to allow your lover to inherit something from you because your relationship is seen as less legitimate. And I really would just like to commend you for that realism.
thank you.
I was just curious to know, it was a short film, 70 minutes, but I was curious, what did you have to delete, and what were like your like painful like moments of like getting rid of those scenes, or like those points that you really wanted to make in the film?
I mean, I'll just say one thing is that I did cry a lot with Roya, because she's such a tough ass, and like would just be like, no, this needs to be a really good story. So I mean, I had to kind of give up like pretty much everything, but then also in a weird way, I feel like everything somehow made it in. We were just talking about that actually before the end of the screening, was just that weirdly like it's like one of those cubes that like, you know, like I just somehow like I feel like all the pieces found a place, and I don't know.
I mean, my background is not in documentary filmmaking. I mean, I don't really have a background in film at all, but because I was a programmer, I was watching like 500 films a year, and but they weren't so much documentaries. But I kind of knew what people weren't doing in documentaries, and I was like, this would be cool if we did this in a documentary. But it was more in terms of narrative. So I was really interested in creating a story, because I felt like if we went into the fictional aspect of it, we would be released from this sense, from this like bind that documentary puts you in to tell the truth. And I didn't want to tell the truth. And also, I remember in early conversations with Wu, that was the thing that made him most uncomfortable about the film that he had, was that he didn't want it to somehow tell the truth or something, or like have to represent the women of the bar. And so, so I just really wanted to create a story. So a lot of the times we would be like, oh, that's not really happened, or it didn't happen in that order, and I'd be like, doesn't matter.
And so telling the truth is about the idea that you must tell the truth about yourself in a way that represents people as a whole in some way. And so the demand to do that is part of what you were trying to resist. So do you have any last thoughts that you want to share with our utopic audience? Any thoughts on Utopia in particular?
I don't know, I'm thinking a lot just about the limits of what any one person can know. And so a lot of this process was about, you know, just trying to define what the realness was about, the feelings that one could have, you know. And so like the fear of someone being deported or like the fear of what was going to happen with the film going out. Like those are real fears, but actually like there's a limitation to what one can know, and that the danger in kind of presuming control is that you become protective in this way that presumes a kind of authority over someone else. So I really think that, I don't know, there are so many ways in which Nicole, the woman in the pink living room, like I think that she has a lot of wise kind of, I feel like she was kind of a spiritual guide. She is a spiritual guide for me in life, and in the film especially, she has a lot of ways of speaking that really challenge, I think, our perception of like other, you know, so.
And I would say that one of the things that really inspired Wu and I when we were as a ground was this talk that Bernice Reagan Johnson gave called Coalitional Politics at the Turn of the Century. She gave it in 1981. And there's this thing that she said that has just always stayed with me, which is she's talking about the process of collaborating and being in coalition and conflict, but also just realizing that even though you can create these spaces where only people like you get to go in, at the end of the day, the world isn't made up of just people like you. And we all deserve to live in the world in a way that makes us feel happy and in a way that we can move and feel free. And the act of struggling for that can be really hard, but it's also just really important to remember that we can do that together. And that togetherness, I think, is the thing that makes it like so, you know, as the bar says, like beautiful, messy, what is it? Fractured, messy, and so beautiful, you know? So I think that like utopia isn't necessarily this thing that we have to wait for. I feel like it can be found in struggling with each other and struggling like shoulder to shoulder.
I want you to join me in thanking Wu and Roya for a wonderful film and a wonderful evening.